Mr. Chair. My first question to Moonshot. Do you receive funding from the Government of Canada?
Yes, sir. We do receive funding from the Government of Canada.
And do you exclusively focus on the far right, or do you focus on extremism across the political spectrum?
No, absolutely. We focus on extremism across the political spectrum. So our work in Canada has always focused on both the violent far right and Daesh and Al-Qaeda inspired terrorism.
But like, I wouldn't accuse Daesh of being, far right or far left. Do you focus on anything related to anarchist or environmental terrorism, or, last year we had dozens of churches burned down in Canada. Have you done any research on those specific instances?
Absolutely, sir. We look at domestic violent extremism across the ideological spectrum, and as an organization, we basically follow the evidence. So, this doesn't mean that we're seeing the threat from other kinds of ideological groups diminish, but we just look at where the evidence base takes us, and we'll proportionately invest in prevention based on that.
Examples of your group's investigations into groups such as, environmental extremism, anarchist extremism, anti-religious, specifically targeting, Christian or Jewish groups?
We absolutely do. In every country that we deliver both research and interventions, we are covering far left extremism as well, where it's violence and where violence is incited.
Can you give some examples of that in Canada?
Our work Sure, sir. So in Canada, our projects that were funded were specifically looking at violent far-right and Al-Qaeda and Daesh-inspired terrorism. More recently, we're looking at incel-inspired violence. We have not done work yet funded by the Canadian government looking at far-left extremism, but I would welcome the opportunity to do so.
So you're saying the Canadian government is only funding you to look into Islamic Daesh-related extremism and far-right extremism? There's no funding from the Government of Canada to deal with environmental extremism or bigotry against Christian or Jewish groups in Canada?
I can't speak to the full range of funding that the Canadian government is currently providing across those issues. To our group specifically, our work has focused on Al-Qaeda, Daesh, far-right extremism, and incel violence. But as I mentioned, we would welcome the opportunity to do work across the ideological spectrum.
Are you aware of any of your peer groups that have received funding to look at far-left extremism in Canada from the Canadian government?
I'm not personally aware of the full extent of programs that have been funded by public safety, but I believe that all of those projects are publicly listed online. So I would welcome any inquiries, any questions around that to look at the public release around funding by the Canadian government.
No, I appreciate that. But you're saying, as somebody who works in this field, I'm sure you're familiar with other organizations that also receive government funding that work similarly. To your knowledge, there are no funded studies from the Government of Canada to deal with environmental extremism or far-left extremism?
I wouldn't have the background to answer that question, sir. I can't really speak for...
You don't know.
But I would not have awareness of the full range of projects that are funded, so I wouldn't feel comfortable saying one way or the other. But our group certainly has not received funding to work beyond Daesh, Al-Qaeda, far-right extremism, and incel terrorism, but we would certainly welcome it, and prevention should be proportionate based on the data.
Would you say that if the government, if it were proven that the government were not funding looking into this, that this would be a blind spot of the government if they were not funding research into this area?
My belief is that research should span the entire ideological spectrum. We should use data to then inform where prevention should be based. But I would also mention that most prevention programs should really be cross-ideological. Every prevention program should be equipped to handle any case of violence, whether it's coming from violent far-left groups, violent far-right groups, or Al-Qaeda and Daesh-inspired terrorism.
I couldn't agree more. I'll move on to Mr. Hadley. In terms of your work in countering terrorism, we had a recent case in Montreal, still under investigation, but a former Conservative cabinet minister and staffer for RBC, Michael Fortier, had his 2 vehicles torched in Montreal, and an anarchist environmentalist group has claimed responsibility for the attacks because of RBC's funding for oil and gas projects and pipeline projects in Canada. We've been told that attribution is a key thing that we need to deal with. Can you kind of comment on the importance of unmasking who are truly behind these attacks?
Many thanks. In terms of importance, could you clarify importance to whom?
To the attribution of who is behind the attacks. Like, how important is it to unmask the actual people behind these terrorist attacks? And how would you go about doing that?
I think that's probably a question for law enforcement and intelligence agencies. Certainly the work at Tech Against Terrorism isn't focused on identifying individuals, but rather supporting tech platforms in reducing their activity online. Where appropriate, where there is a realistic threat to life, we ensure that alert is sent to the relevant authorities, including in Canada. But as to the attribution, I think that's probably a question for law enforcement in terms of the measures that they may have and the mechanisms that they have available under Canadian law in order to conduct surveillance and carry out intelligence operations.
Thank you very much.